was folding my clothes in the quiet of my bedroom when my brother's fist hammered against my door again. His voice cut through the thin wood like a blade. Mom wanted me out by the weekend. No conversation, no explanation. Just a command passed, down like I was some distant tenant they could discard at will. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. The house felt different after Dad died. The laughter that once bounced off these walls had shriveled into stiff silences that pressed against my chest every morning. My mother, who used to check on me before bed and ask about my day, had retreated somewhere I couldn't reach. She leaned on my brother now for every decision, and he soaked up that power like dry earth drinks rain. I became the problem child overnight, not because I'd changed, but because grief had rearranged everyone else around me. Suddenly, I was taking up space, not contributing enough, making it hard for them to move on. They wielded those phrases like polite daggers, cutting me down piece by piece while maintaining their righteous composure. The irony burned in my throat. While my brother was building his business and networking at conferences, I was the one who stayed home during Dad's final months. I cooked his favorite meals when he could barely keep anything down. I sat beside his hospital bed reading him old Western novels until my voice went hoarse. I held his hand when the morphine made him forget our names, but none of that counted anymore. Memory is selective, and guilt makes people rewrite history to suit their needs. They wanted to sell the house, said it was time to start fresh, to let go of the past. They spoke about our childhood home like it was some burden they'd been carrying, not the place where Dad taught me to ride a bike in the driveway, where Mom used to braid my hair by the kitchen window on Sunday mornings. They didn't ask if I had anywhere to go. They didn't care. The plan was brutally simple. Pack my things, push me out, and turn my bedroom into a home office. I was just another piece of furniture to be cleared out during their fresh start. The betrayal wasn't in their words. It was in their eyes that couldn't meet mine when they delivered their verdict. Like they were ashamed, but not enough to stop. Like they knew what they were doing was wrong, but had convinced themselves it was necessary. I didn't argue. Not with them. Arguing would only feed my brother's righteousness and deepen my mother's silence. Instead, I retreated to my room and began pulling out documents I hadn't touched since Dad passed. Yellowed papers tucked away in a shoebox beneath my bed, forgotten in the chaos of funeral arrangements and grief. I remembered those long afternoons when Dad would take me to his lawyer appointments. I was maybe 16, bored and confused about why he needed me there when my brother was the one interested in business stuff. But Dad insisted. He'd sit me down in those leather chairs that smelled like old books and coffee, and we'd wait, together in comfortable silence. Once, while we sat in that waiting room, he turned to me with that serious expression he got when he was about to say something important. "You're the only one who really listens," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And someday, that's going to matter more than you know." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just being sentimental, the way parents get when they're trying to make their quiet child feel special. But now, holding those documents, in my trembling hands, his words echoed through me like a prophecy finally coming to pass. In the months after his funeral, I'd tucked those papers away without really reading them. Grief made everything blur together. Insurance forms, bank statements, legal documents. It all felt too overwhelming, too final. I let my brother handle the important stuff, while I tried to figure out how to exist in a world without Dad's steady presence. Now each page came alive in my hands. Last will and testament, property deeds, insurance policies. And there, in Dad's careful handwriting, along the margins of several documents, were notes I'd never noticed before. Little reminders to himself, names, dates, and my name, circled, in blue ink, appearing more often than I'd expected. My hands shook as I read through the deed transfer documents. The language was dense and formal, full of legal terminology that made my eyes cross. But certain phrases jumped out at me like beacons in the fog. Sole beneficiary. Transfer of ownership. Effective immediately upon death of grantor, Dad hadn't just left me sentimental items or a small inheritance. He'd done something much more significant, something I was only beginning to understand. He'd seen what was coming before I did. He'd watched my brother's growing ambition, and my mother's increasing dependence on him. He'd noticed the way family dynamics were shifting, the way I was being slowly pushed to the margins of my own family. And in his quiet, methodical way, he'd made sure I wouldn't be left completely powerless. I spent that entire night reading through every document, cross-referencing dates and signatures. My brother's voice drifted through the walls as he talked on the phone with real estate agents, his tone confident and commanding. He was already planning open houses, discussing market values, dividing up proceeds that weren't his to divide. They moved around the house like they already owned every breath of air in it. My mother began sorting through Dad's belongings with clinical efficiency, boxing up his clothes for donation, clearing out his desk drawers. She worked with the determined focus of someone trying to erase painful reminders, but I could see the way her hands lingered on his reading glasses, his coffee mug, the little notepad where he used to write his daily to-do lists. My brother brought home flowers and a bottle of wine one evening, celebrating prematurely. He'd found a buyer, he announced. Someone willing to pay asking price with minimal contingencies. They could close within 60 days. Perfect timing, he said, not looking at me. Sarah can find her own place, and we can all move forward. Sarah. He said my name like it was a minor detail in his grand plan, a small logistical issue to be resolved. Not his sister. Not the daughter who'd lived in this house for 23 years. Just Sarah, the inconvenience. I watched them plan my erasure with quiet fascination. They discussed paint colors for the walls where my childhood photos hung. They measured my bedroom for office furniture. They talked about me in past tense while I was sitting right there, as if I were already gone. The agent came by twice that week. A sharp woman in her 50s with perfectly styled hair and a briefcase full of marketing materials. She walked through our home like she was cataloging inventory, taking notes on square footage and natural lighting. She barely acknowledged my presence, treating me like part of the furniture that would be cleared out before showing. Lovely bones, she kept saying about the house. Great bones. With a little updating, this will sell fast. Great bones. As if our home was some dead thing to be picked clean and repurposed. As if the laughter that once filled these rooms, the tears we'd cried here, the dreams we'd shared at the kitchen table meant nothing compared to market value and profit margins. I didn't tell them what I'd discovered in those documents. Not yet. I watched them make their plans, schedule their appointments, divide up money that wasn't theirs to split. I watched my brother puff up with self-importance as he played the role of family patriarch, making decisions for everyone without consulting anyone. Part of me wanted to see how far they'd go, how completely they'd erase me from the equation before I revealed what Dad had really intended. It was a cruel experiment, maybe, but grief and betrayal had made me curious about the depths of their selfishness. The answer came sooner than I expected. My brother cornered me in the kitchen one morning while I was making coffee. He had that look he got when he was about to deliver what he considered tough love, chin slightly raised, arms crossed, voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and firm. "Sarah, we need to talk about your timeline," he said. "The buyers want to do a walkthrough next week, and it would be better if your room was already cleared out. It'll show better as office space." Better. Everything was about what would be better for the sale, better for the market, better for everyone except me. "Where exactly do you expect me to go?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He shrugged, as if my homelessness was a minor inconvenience I should have figured out by now. "You're young. You'll find something." Maybe it's time to stand on your own feet anyway. Stand on my own feet. As if I hadn't been contributing to household expenses. As if I hadn't sacrificed job opportunities to care for our dying father. As if my entire adult life hadn't been shaped by family obligations while he was free to pursue his ambitions. What about Dad? I asked quietly. What would he think about this? My brother's jaw tightened. Dad's gone, Sarah. We can't live in the past forever. But he was wrong about that. Dad wasn't gone. Not completely. He was there in those documents I'd been studying. He was there in the careful planning he'd done to protect me from exactly this situation. He was there in the conversations we'd had that my brother had never bothered to listen to, in the quiet wisdom he'd shared with the daughter who actually paid attention. The real estate agent scheduled the final walkthrough for the following Thursday. Contracts would be signed that afternoon, she said. Everything was moving ahead right on schedule. I let them believe it would be that simple. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more defined. The real estate agent pulled into our driveway at exactly 10 o'clock, her silver sedan gleaming in the sunlight. She emerged with her usual professional smile and that briefcase full of papers that would supposedly transfer our family home to strangers. My brother had dressed for the occasion, in his best button-down shirt and the tie Dad had given him for his college graduation. He stood by the front door like a proud host, ready to welcome the buyers and close the deal that would secure his vision of our family's future. My mother hovered nearby, clutching her purse with white knuckles, her face a careful mask of composed resignation. The buyers were a young couple with a toddler who immediately began exploring our living room with the fearless curiosity of childhood. They spoke in hushed, excited tones about their plans for the space, where they'd put the Christmas tree, how they'd update the kitchen, whether the backyard was big enough for a swing set. I watched from the hallway, invisible as always, as strangers made themselves at home in the place where I'd taken my first steps, spoken my first words, cried my first tears. They examined our family photos still hanging on the walls like they were part of the existing decor, studying images of birthday parties and holidays, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons when we'd been happy without knowing how precious that happiness was. The bones really are lovely, the wife said to her husband, unconsciously echoing the agent's earlier assessment. I can see us growing old here. In the house where my father had actually grown old, where he'd spent his final months dreaming of grandchildren who might someday play in this yard, where his presence still lingered in every creaking floorboard and familiar shadow. The agent spread her papers across our dining room table with practiced efficiency. Purchase agreement, title transfer, closing documents. She explained each form with the brisk confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before, reducing our family's entire history to a series of signatures and notarized stamps. Now, we'll just need all the current owners to sign, she said, looking expectantly at my brother and mother. The title shows joint ownership between Margaret Williams and David Williams, but since David is deceased, Margaret, as the surviving spouse, has full authority to proceed with the sale. My brother nodded importantly, reaching for the pen. This was his moment of triumph, the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation. He'd orchestrated everything perfectly, found the buyers, negotiated the terms, arranged for my convenient disappearance from the equation, but I stepped forward before he could sign. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "Could I see the title documents?" The agent looked up, seeming to notice me for the first time. "I'm sorry. Are you family?" "I'm Sarah Williams. I live here." My brother shot me a warning look. "Sarah, we've been through this. This doesn't concern you." But the agent was already shuffling through her papers, pulling out the official title document. "Of course you have a right to see it, though I should mention that unless you're listed as an owner, you won't need to sign anything." She handed me the document with polite professionalism, probably expecting me to glance at it briefly and step back into my assigned role as the displaced family member. My brother watched with barely concealed impatience, eager to get past this minor interruption and proceed with business. I took the paper in my hands and studied it carefully, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. The room had gone quiet, except for the soft sound of the toddler playing with his toy cars on our hardwood floor. Even he seemed to sense that something important was happening. The title was exactly as the agent had described: joint ownership, between Margaret Williams and David Williams, dated 15 years ago when my parents had refinanced the mortgage. But there was something else. A second document, stapled to the back. An addendum dated just 2 years ago, shortly after Dad's cancer diagnosis. "There's been a mistake," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. The agent frowned. "I'm sorry?" "This isn't the current title." I held up the addendum. "There was a transfer of ownership 2 years ago. The house isn't owned by Margaret Williams anymore." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet we'd been sitting in moments before. This was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes, when all the birds stop singing and the air itself seems to hold its breath. My brother's face went through several expressions at once: confusion, irritation, and the first flicker of something that might have been fear. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" I handed the addendum to the real estate agent. "My father transferred ownership of the property before he died. The current owner is Sarah Williams." The agent's professional composure cracked slightly as she read through the document. Her eyebrows rose, and she glanced between the paper and my face as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "This appears to be legitimate," she said slowly. "It's been properly notarized and filed with the county clerk's office. According to this, Sarah Williams has been the sole owner of this property for the past 2 years. The young couple exchanged confused glances. The husband cleared his throat. "So, who exactly are we buying the house from?" That was the question that hung in the air like smoke, choking the confidence right out of my brother's carefully planned triumph. He stared at the document in the agent's hands as if it were written in a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. My mother spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "That's impossible." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "David never mentioned. He wouldn't have." But even as she said it, I could see the recognition dawning in her eyes. She was remembering things she'd forgotten or chosen not to see. The private conversations Dad had insisted on having with his lawyer. The documents he'd asked her to witness without fully explaining their purpose. The way he'd always spoken, about making sure I was taken care of after he was gone. "He did mention it," I said gently. "He told me that day in Mr. Peterson's office when we updated his will. He said I was the only one who really listened, and that someday it would matter." The Bai. Truth was settling over the room like dust after an explosion. The agent was frantically checking her files, trying to understand how such a fundamental error had occurred. The buyers were whispering to each other about wasted trips and broken promises, and my family was staring at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their living room and claimed to live there. "This is ridiculous," my brother finally managed, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Even if that document is real, which I doubt, Dad wasn't thinking clearly those last few years. The cancer, the medications. He wasn't competent to make decisions like that." The agent looked up from her papers. "Actually, the transfer was completed well before Mr. Williams became seriously ill. The date shows it was executed 2 years ago, and it includes a statement from his physician confirming his mental competency at the time of signing. Dad had thought of everything. Even facing his own mortality, battling cancer, watching his family begin to fracture under the weight of grief and fear. He'd had the presence of mind to protect me from exactly this situation. He'd seen what I was too loyal to see. That love and family obligation weren't enough to guarantee kindness when money and convenience were at stake. The young family gathered their things quietly, sensing that they'd stumbled into the middle of a private catastrophe. The agent offered awkward apologies and promised to contact them about other available properties. Within minutes, Our living room had emptied of strangers, leaving only family and the wreckage of my brother's carefully laid plans. My mother sat, heavily in Dad's old recliner, the chair she usually avoided because it still smelled like his aftershave and the coffee he'd spilled on the armrest during his final weeks. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that her husband had made such a significant decision without consulting her. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, more to herself than to anyone else. I could have been cruel in that moment. I could have pointed out all the signs she'd chosen to ignore, all the conversations she'd avoided, all the times Dad had tried to discuss the future while she'd changed the subject or left the room. Grief affects people differently, and her way of coping had been to retreat from anything that reminded her of loss. Instead, I sat on the couch across from her, the same spot where I'd curled up next to Dad during his final months, reading to him or just holding his hand while we watched old movies together. "He was trying to protect me," I said simply. "He could see what was happening to our family, how I was being pushed aside. He wanted to make sure I'd still have a home after he was gone." My brother was pacing now, his composure completely shattered. "This is insane. You can't just take the house. We had plans. We had a buyer. We were going to split the proceeds and all move on with our lives." "Whose lives?" I asked quietly. "You were going to move on with your lives. I was just supposed to disappear." The anger that had been building in me for months finally found its voice, but it came out calm and steady rather than explosive. This wasn't the time for screaming or dramatic confrontations. This was the time for truth, delivered with the quiet dignity Dad had always modeled. "You wanted to erase me from this family," I continued. "Turn my childhood bedroom into your office space. Divide up money from selling my father's house without even asking where I was supposed to go. You made plans for everyone except the person who actually sacrificed everything to take care of him when he was dying." My brother stopped pacing. For a moment, his face showed something that might have been shame, but it quickly hardened into defensive anger. "We would have helped you find a place. We weren't going to leave you homeless. You were going to give me the weekend to figure it out." That stopped him cold, because it was true, and we all knew it. In his grand vision of the family's fresh start, I was nothing more than a loose end to be tied up quickly and efficiently. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that dripped onto her hands folded in her lap. "I thought we were doing the right thing," she whispered. "I thought it would be easier for all of us to start over somewhere new." "Easier for who?" I asked. "It would have been easier for you to not deal with the reminders of Dad in this house. Easier for Michael to sell the property and take his cut. But what about what Dad wanted? What about what I wanted?" The conversation that followed was long and painful and necessary. We talked about things we should have discussed months ago, feelings we'd buried under the logistics of death and dying. My mother admitted that she'd been so overwhelmed by grief that she'd let my brother make decisions she should have been part of. My brother, to his credit, eventually acknowledged that he'd gotten carried away with the power of being the family's primary decision-maker. But acknowledgement isn't the same as absolution. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. And the fact remained that they'd been willing to discard me completely when it suited their plans. The house grew quiet as afternoon faded into evening. My mother retreated to her bedroom early, emotionally exhausted by the day's revelations. My brother lingered in the living room, staring at the family photos he'd been so eager to pack away. "I still think Dad should have talked to us about this," he said finally. "We're family. We should have made this decision together." "We are family," I agreed. "But you stopped treating me like family the moment Dad died. You treated me like a burden you couldn't wait to shed." He didn't argue with that. He couldn't, because it was true. After he went home to his own apartment, I walked through the house alone, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just the place where I'd grown up anymore. It was my house now, my responsibility, my sanctuary. Dad had given me more than just property. He'd given me the power to determine my own future. I stood in his old office, surrounded by the books he'd loved and the desk where he'd paid bills and written letters and planned for a future he wouldn't live to see. On the wall hung a photo of the two of us from my high school graduation, both of us grinning at the camera with identical crooked smiles. "You knew," I said to his image. "You knew they'd try to push me out, and you made sure they couldn't." That night, I planted new curtains in the living room, bright yellow ones that Dad would have loved and my mother would have thought too bold. I opened all the windows and let in air that felt different somehow, lighter and cleaner than before. The next morning, my mother came downstairs to find me making breakfast in our kitchen. She paused in the doorway, and for a moment I thought she might turn around and go back upstairs. But instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals together. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a fair question. The dynamics of our relationship had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer the daughter living in her house. She was the mother, living in mine. But family is more complicated than property ownership, and love doesn't always follow the same rules as real estate law. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," I said, "if that's what you want." She nodded slowly, tears starting to form in her eyes again. "I've been so angry since your father died. Angry at him for leaving. Angry at myself for not being stronger. Angry at you for reminding me of him every time I looked at you." "I know," I said. And I did know. Grief had made strangers of us all. We talked over breakfast about practical things, bills and maintenance and household responsibilities. But we also talked about harder things, like forgiveness and trust, and what it means to be family when the person who held you together is gone. My brother came by later that week, sheepish and subdued. He didn't apologize exactly, but he helped me fix the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom and stayed for dinner without being asked. Small gestures, but meaningful ones for a family learning to rebuild itself. The house felt different now, not just because the ownership had changed, but because the relationships within its walls were shifting and settling into new patterns. I was no longer the overlooked younger sister, the convenient caretaker, the disposable family member. I was the woman Dad had raised me to be, someone who listened, someone who remembered, someone who inherited not just property, but the wisdom to use power with grace. Sometimes, when I walk past Dad's old recliner, I can still hear his voice echoing through the rooms. "You're the only one who really listens, and someday that's going to matter." He was right, as he so often was. In a world that rewards the loudest voices and the boldest actions, there's still power in paying attention, in noticing what others miss, in being the child who sits quietly in lawyers' offices and actually hears what's being said. They tried to evict me from my own story, to edit me out of the family narrative like an inconvenient subplot. But Dad had already written the ending, in careful legal language and quiet foresight, and the kind of love that protects even from beyond the grave. The house is mine now, but more than that, my voice is mine. My place in this family is mine, and no one, not grief, not guilt, not the small cruelties that people call practical decisions, can take that away from me again. I am not the shadow they tried to make me. I am the daughter who listened when it mattered most, and in the end, that made all the difference.